Welcome back to the channel. I've got some interesting bug news for you today. This is an article that's coming out of Kansas, I believe. Kstate and USDA launch an $800,000 initiative to combat destructive insects threatening America's food supply. This is in particular for the Khapra beetle and the larger grain borer, which I'll explain what those are in just a minute. But basically, Kansas State University and the USDA have launched this initiative to quote-unquote prevent these pests from entering the food supply, as they could significantly raise the cost of food and harm the grain industry. So the Khapra beetle and the lesser grain, or the larger grain beetle, let me show you what those guys look like. So the image in that article is Khapra beetle, although it's not a great image. This is a drawing of Khapra beetle. These are dermestids, which is a small group of beetles, a small group of small beetles. These are only a couple millimeters long that tend to infest stored products and dry goods, so like pantry goods, and are a major concern for like grain silos and warehouses, things like that. They are pretty prevalent all over the world, and the U.S. has been theoretically attempting to keep them out. They're especially common from places like the Middle East and India and Northern Africa, kind of dry climates. And they pose a serious financial risk, theoretically. I say theoretically because they are already here. So the domestic that you might be more common with are called carpet beetles. These guys tend to get into pantries, but they also get into like wool and leather and stuff like that. Or if you have an insect collection, they tend to get into your insect collection. And they're more colorful, so they're more easy to recognize. But these are also domestids. This is genus Anthrenus, whereas Khapra beetle is Trochoderma granarium. And then the larger grain borer is a type of Bistrychid. Bistrychids are fairly long bullet-shaped beetles that generally infest wood, but there are a handful that attack grain that are a serious concern. This one and Rhizopertha dominica is another one. But they tend to also be very small. Anything that's attacking grain tends to be pretty small. This is just about 5 millimeters, but they tend to have these very these very iconic antennae where it's like a bunch of thin beads and then 3 giant beads that form a club. And then they also tend to have really bug eyes, a steep butt, which is called the declivity. They tend to have little spikes on their forehead, which is called the pronotum. And then sometimes they also have hooks on their butt. But these also tend to be a problem in like dry wood products, furniture, stuff like that, and they will produce a lot of holes in the furniture. And in this case, they attack grain. So these are a Bistrychid if you're not familiar with the family, Bistrychidae, and then these other ones, these Khapra beetles, are Dermestidae. Anyway, so back to this article, why it's a scam. So this is an $800,000 initiative to show that the U.S. is taking this seriously. The issue is that these beetles are already in the U.S. I worked in port trade compliance for almost a decade and saw these constantly. These are constantly moving through the airports, and they're not being stopped. They're constantly coming in through trade, and they have been since the 50s. And it says here that the U.S. has been fighting them since the 50s. They spent $125 million to eliminate it in 3 southwestern states. You don't really eliminate these. These sorts of beetles are extremely resistant to pesticides and fumigants, which is why they're such a problem. They're extremely hard to control because they live in cryptic places, and they are extremely toxic or extremely toxin resistant, all forms of toxins. The copper beetle in particular can live 20 years in a hibernative state called diapause, without food, without water, in very dry conditions. You don't just eliminate them. And not only that, we're constantly getting these reintroduced into the United States, literally on a daily basis. All flights coming in from West Africa almost always have these aboard. Shipments of rice and things like that from India almost always have these infesting them. It's shipments of coffee from Asia, shipments of brassware and things like that are heavily infested with these. And if you think we're getting all of them, you're out of your mind. That's not how that's not what is happening here. So why is the USDA why is the U.S. government paying Kansas State $800,000 over 5 years to come up with initiatives to control this and blah, 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 blah. It's a scam, basically. And it's a scam that the government that the government does, and Kansas State is just taking advantage of this. Basically, the U.S. government has to show, or it has to keep up the appearance that these are not in the United States. And it has to show that it's taking the possible introduction of these into the United States seriously, so that the U.S. doesn't get a bunch of trade quarantines levied against them by foreign nations. They would stop accepting U.S. goods. They would want U.S. goods to be treated before they arrive in port. These are already in the U.S., and it's largely just because people aren't looking for them. The U.S. government doesn't take it seriously looking for these. They don't want to find them. And the reason they don't want to find them is because other countries would immediately embargo or restrict a bunch of U.S. goods. So this is basically to prop up the lie that they're not here, that these insects aren't here, although they've probably been here for 70 years. And just so you know, like, even if we weren't getting all of these flights and stuff coming in, and warehouses full of these and all this other stuff, Mexico is infested with these. Heavily infested with these, and has been for 70 years or more. They just have to fly across the southern border. And to pretend that they're not doing that, or not moving with all the people that travel across the southern border every day, all this other stuff, considering that you're talking about these infest dry goods, it's just an insane position. So this is largely just the USDA paying off K-State to say they're not here, so that the U.S. doesn't get trade embargoes. That's all this is. But it's an interesting little article that kind of masks over a lot of more complicated things that are going on under the surface. But with that, I'll talk to you guys later. Like and subscribe.